Hello, class. Since we can't meet in person this week, I'm recording a lecture just to go through some basics in terms of proportion and scale. Now, over the past few weeks, we've been going through the basics of volume and form and how these things all work together to draw in perspective. What I'm going to do now is take that to a whole other kind of level, take all the things we've learned about drawing, boxes, cylinders, all those core forms, breaking those down into objects, and now really start to transform these by putting them together into an actual room environment. First things first, as you can see on the screen, it's just a basic kind of blank space right now. What we're going to establish is our basic eye line across the middle of the screen. So the white portion of the screen that you see there is proportioned to basically 8.5 by 11, your standard kind of copy size sheet of paper, just turned on its side horizontally. And I've got some extra wings on the side that I've added for this digital version, just so I can plot 2-point perspective later in my demo here. In addition to that, I've got my single vanishing point in the middle. And of course, this is our eye line. This is our point of view on the scene. It's really important to establish that. I keep reiterating it over the past few weeks, and it is always important to understand what that means and how it all fits together. So unlike other the demos we've done where we've just started building boxes or building forms, what we want to do this time is something a little bit different. I've established a rectangular box here, but instead of us turning that into a box and transforming it back to the vanishing point, what we're going to do this time is we're going to carry those lines out from the vanishing point forward. So we have a simple 1-point perspective room. We've got obviously the ceiling, we've got the walls, and then we have the floor established here. I've given the floor a little bit more space since we tend to be able to put more interesting things on the floor than on the ceiling. So I've just proportioned my eye line and the proportion of the room so that we have a little bit more floor space to work with as far as that goes. Now, we've set up a room, but what we don't have is any sense of scale. We have no idea how big anything is compared to each other. Now, in a lot of drawing tutorial books and a lot of drawing tutorials, they will tell you that the best way to build a room in perspective is by establishing a grid. They'll show you how to draw perfect grids and set up all those units and things like that. And it can be an effective way to draw, and you can get quite a bit of accuracy in doing so, but it's also very time consuming. And what we want to do is be able to draw rooms and spaces quickly and proportionately without having to go through all that laborious process every single time. And so what I want to do this time is show you a faster way to work, an easier way for you to measure with something that you have in front of you all the time. And what that is, the simplest measurement of all, is yourself, a person. As soon as we set up a person within this space, as soon as we focus on the proportion of that person and show them standing in this room, we now have a sense of the relative size of everything around them. We are people. We understand the world through our own proportion. So many times students will say to me, well, how big should I make a door? Well, how big is the furniture? Where does this stuff fit together? And the easiest way to measure it is to understand yourself and to use a person as your actual measuring tool. It's way, way easier for you to understand something is ankle height or knee height or hip height or, shoulder height or top of the head, bottom of the chin, or some kind of height where you have to get on your tippy toes and try and reach it. Anything in between these simple kinds of forms and these simple kinds of measurements is going to be easy for you to understand and easy for you to measure against. So start with a human figure in your space, and all of a sudden you will be able to measure much, much better proportion, much easier. Now, in this particular case, I have an eye line that crosses the eye line of this figure. That is not required. I'm going to say that again because so many times students will assume just because I do this in part of the demo that they need to have their scale figure with the eye line crossing the eye line of the character. All that means is that our figure is essentially the same, approximately the same height as we are. They match our point of view. That does not always have to be the case, and I'm going to show you more examples where it does not. But for this figure, that's what we've done here. Now, if I want to add something simple like a door to this particular scene, all I have to do is measure against how big a door would be compared to a person. Here's something really, really important to think about. Your furniture, everything that you put into this room is going to be measured against this figure, and you want to try and make it feel, relatively realistic. But also, you don't want to, go crazy trying to make this architecturally accurate. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to get sloppy. For my initial sketch, I'm just sort of popping out this really, really simple door frame. And there is depth. Obviously, this part of the door frame is above the door. I'm just sketching this stuff out. And I could use the line tool and make that even more accurate. I'll probably do that for other portions of this drawing. But just as a quick placeholder, I'm just sketching in that door frame, okay? So that we've got a little bit of depth and an actual bit of proportion to it. Now I'm looking at, okay, where I want to put that door handle on the door. Well, first things first, where's a door handle? Instead of worrying about exact centimeters or meters or inches or feet or any of those kinds of measuring tool measurements, all I have to do is think about, if I'm reaching out towards the door, where is it going to be approximately, this kind of height? And doors vary from height to height in terms of where that door handle goes. As long as it feels like it's possible and it feels like it's proportionate and the audience believes in it, then you've got a door handle that works. And I think that that's a really crucial thing to keep in mind here. Don't sweat over, these kinds of tiny things. We are going to put all sorts of detail in this room, and we are going to be thinking about all sorts of different proportions, but equally, getting something down quickly that feels like it's believable is more important, than worrying about all the kind of measuring it to an exact space that you are trying to copy from some photograph or something like that. Like, yes, we're going to look to reference. Yes, we're going to try and get this thing looking as accurate as possible. And you notice here I'm going to have a bit of a gap at the bottom of the door because doors don't sit exactly to the ground. And there we have a relatively realistic door in terms of our overall proportion. Now, if I want to start adding other furniture and things, all I need to do is start to compare it to this figure and compare it to this door. So one of the easy ways to build out this furniture, and the nice thing is about the majority of furniture, is that we, as people, like to line things up to the walls. We like to line things up and keep them straight. That's not to say that every single item in this room is going to conform to that central vanishing point, but the majority of the furniture will. So if I want to put together a small bookshelf, I think about, well, how deep is that bookshelf going to be? Compare that to my figure. With digital, this is even easier to do. I can just take that back to the vanishing point and I can go, well, how tall is a bookshelf? Some bookshelves are taller than doors. Some of them, you would need to bring in kind of sideways in order to have them fit. As long as it feels like it's possible, and it feels like it could fit the actual spacing of a door, or sorry, of a bookshelf, then you've got something that can work. And that's kind of the big, kind of trick here, is that it's not about, you are getting something accurate and you are getting something proportionate, but we're not laboring over it in an insane amount. How thick would these individual sides of the shelves be? I can pick varying thicknesses. There are all kinds of thicknesses that we can see in different furniture, as long as it feels like it works. If you're not sure what you want this thing to look like, get some visual reference and then build this thing out. Always draw through your forms, super, super important that you do so. And the reason why is because I want to have as much, consistent perspective in terms of how these shelves are built. Because this is below the eye line, we're looking down upon that shelf, dropping each of those in place. And then I can carry each of them across and draw each of them through as much as possible, trying to draw this consistently with three-dimensional form. The nice thing is with simple kinds of shapes like this, The line tool is such a dream to work with. It's just fast, 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 at least for my initial construction. That one's a little bit thin. I always adjust it. When you're doing this stuff on pencil and paper, it can be a huge pain in the butt to get this kind of consistency. But with the digital, you can just knock it out really, really fast, and it's going to look really good. And of course, I will go over this, later and do finalized lines, but just even for my initial construction, notice that, of course, the shelves are getting narrower the closer we get to the eye line automatically. That's just how they build out. And I can check those against each other. If you're using Photoshop and you hold Shift, you'll get nice horizontal or vertical lines. So you don't even have to worry about whether or not those are straight. As long as you're holding Shift, they will be straight all the way across. And I can just pop in those shelves fast, fast, fast. Because we're above the eye line now, we're now looking up at this particular shelf. It's really thin because it's barely above the eye line, but it is looking up. Okay, just like that, I've got a shelf that's proportionate. In order to grab stuff on the top shelf, this person would need to probably stand on a stepping stool, and that's fine. That is totally possible for some bookshelves. That's the way some of these things work. And so, now if I want to, I can fill that shelf with items. I can do all sorts of different stuff, but I've got furniture that is proportionate because I have my scale figure that I can compare the sizing to. Does that feel like the size of a shelf? Yeah, it's a pretty wide one. It's relatively deep, but I've got a scale figure that I can compare to. If I want to do something like a window on this particular wall, same kind of deal. All I need to do is compare that sizing. How tall are windows? There's all kinds of different heights for windows. There's no one size. As long as you make something that feels like it's proportionate and can work as a window, then the viewers are going to believe in it, and you're going to have something that looks solid. This is where you can pull up some reference material and double check these things. But for the most part, all I do is I look and I go, okay, if I think of, windows in my own house, the top, the pole where you would have the drapes hanging down or where the blinds would be stored is out of my reach. I generally would have to get on top of something in order to reach it. So it's going to be right near the ceiling. Great. So I'm going to drop that line down here. I'm going to move that line. How far down does it go? Well, sometimes, windowsill is around hip height. Sometimes it's lower. Sometimes it's higher. As long as it feels like it's proportionate, as long as it feels like it could be the size of a window, then I've got a box that I can work with. I'm following the 1 point perspective because obviously it's going to match the perspective of the room. Whoops. Cut my excess, off here if I want to keep things a little bit simpler. And of course, with digital, it's really fast to be able to give these things their own layers and then merge them later on. So, for a window frame, same kind of deal. I'm going to start with an initial, straight line that's going to be relatively straightforward. Use the line tool to its advantage. This is the stuff that digital does really, really well. Get that initial kind of window frame down, and then I'm going to make it a little bit fancier. Here's a common mistake that a lot of students make, and I see this even in professional drawings. If you're doing a window, you need to think about the window box. Windows are not stickers that you put on walls. They are not paper thin. Walls, particularly walls to the outside, which is what most windows obviously are, the wall that you are cutting a hole in to put glass in and have to the outside is thick. It's got building materials. It's got, the stuff that holds the entire building up. It's got insulation and wires and potentially piping and all kinds of other things. So make that window box deeper than you probably would think by default. Give this a nice deep window box. And what you will find is that your spaces are going to look a lot more solid and a lot more real than if you don't. So I'm going to just, again, back to that vanishing point, copy through there, and then I can always erase the excess once I've got my construction down, especially if I'm putting it on its own layer. Now, the final, version of this, I'm going to add all sorts of drapes and other things, but it's super helpful, even just initially, to get this solid form down to make this thing feel solid. So then I can build on top of it. Whatever other kind of stuff I want to do, I could add all kinds of, drapes and things afterwards. I could put okay, here's going to be the pole where we're going to have the drapes. And let me change up the color here so it's even easier for you to see. So yeah, if I want to have the drapes hanging down or something like that, I can add that over top, but I've got that solid form and structure initially that I'm putting in place. So I know I'm building on top of something really solid as far as that form goes. And whatever parts of the, windowsill and the window box that I've got later on, that's great. Already feeling, relatively solid there. And I could add more complexity. We could make this windowsill obviously a lot more, fancy, or other accoutrements. I could add all kinds of other stuff here if I wanted to add some sort of a flower pot or something on the windowsill. Again, that's going to be an ellipse. So I'm building that out. I'm drawing the footprint of where that object is going to go first. And the bottom ellipse is going to be slightly wider than the top one because that's how perspective works. And away we go. Okay. Now it feels like it's really sitting on that, windowsill, right? As a basic sort of form. I could draw the struts in between the window. I could draw all kinds of other things on the pane of glass. But just for my initial proportion, I can get this stuff down fast, really, really fast in terms of my initial construction and how it all works together. If I wanted to put together, a couch or something like that, or desks or other materials, again, I can start building them out from the wall. Now, the first thing you're thinking here is, okay, that's great, Jim. You've got all this stuff right near the figure, right near the wall. That works. But what happens when we shift outwards? What happens when we move deeper into the room? How are we supposed to check that proportion? Here's where this technique really, really shines. Let me show you. So first thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to create the footprint for a desk. How deep is that desk? I'm comparing it sort of to my figure, getting a sense of it. And now this is sort of the space that I want this desk to take up, this nice big computer table or something like that. That's all fine and good for here near the figure, but what about this space down there? Here's where, this trick really comes in handy. If I make a duplicate of my scale figure, keep them on their own layer, and I use the transform tools, and I put their feet where this is going to be, now I just scale them up, and where whatever part of the anatomy crosses the eye line is the same wherever that figure is in the room. So if this is where the red line, the eye line, crosses the figure in the back, then that's the exact same spot it's going to cross the figure in the front. So as long as I've got the feet lining up to the proper spot, this figure is proportionate. That's the great thing about this trick. Instantly, now, when I build my table, I can figure out what height I want that table to be. If I want that table to be hip height, I can compare it there and then build my initial box. And now I've got a box that is going to be proportionate to my figure at both positions. That's now a hip height table in proportion, fast, fast, fast. Okay. If I want the table to be a bit shorter, I can make it a little bit shorter. I can do all sorts of things to it. I've got that initial box, and then I can always fade that down if I need to. And from there, I can add all the kinds of details I want. I can make this a very specific kind of a desk. I can get rid of my scale figure once I've got that initial kind of proportion. And I could go through and I could look up a very specific kind of, computer desk or furniture or all kinds of different stuff. And I can make this look a lot, fancier. I can make this all kinds of different tables or drawers or all sorts of different stuff that I want to do because I've got that initial proportion and I know how it's going to fit together. Just put down my initial sketch here, keeping it relatively loose in terms of the overall proportion. Got those drawers, got the side of the table leg and so on, right? Whatever that's going to be the drawer, there's going to be a series of other drawers here. whatever kind of design I want to have. Maybe this is, some larger shelf or something. Great. Fast, fast, fast. I've got myself a proportionate desk that's going to fit the space and look like it is the correct size, because it is the correct size. Same kind of thing if I wanted to have a chair in front of this. So if I want to have a chair, I've got my scaled figure. All I need to do is sketch out what that chair is going to be. Now, something like a chair is the perfect time to use a different perspective, because most of the time, yes, you can have the chair perfectly lined up in one point perspective, but we tend to be a little bit more casual about this stuff. So what I might do is I might measure out a 2-point perspective box, drop down that kind of initial proportion. Once I've got my scale figure figured out, here's the common mistake that a lot of people make with chairs. They don't leave enough room for the legs underneath the table. So if this is the size of my chair, just an initial kind of rough form, I can go in and I can make it a much fancier kind of chair later on. I want to make sure that there's enough room that someone could stick their legs between the chair and the, bottom of the desk there, so that they're not going to be cutting off their legs or something. It's a real common mistake I see from a lot of students drawing out spaces like this. And again, this is just an initial kind of a rough positioning. Once I've got that rough form figured out, I can always go back through, lower the opacity on that particular item, give myself a new layer, and then look up, a more specific. Maybe I want to have more like an office chair, something that's got a more circular kind of a seat, something like this, with that particular rounded chair back, like you'd see more of that computer desk kind of chair, all the adjustable little things on the bottom. I'm just using this for rough proportion, rough positioning. I can go through and build those cylinders, build those ellipses, figure out exactly what I want to have in terms of those forms. And again, I'm really quickly roughing this stuff out. I would go through and I would get actual reference of the stuff that I want it to have, build these things out, make sure all the perspective is correct on it. But as an initial, just quick, proportionate looking space, I've now got, desk and chairs that are fitting, this particular scene. And of course, I could go through and I could make much more specific choices in terms of the drawer handles and in terms of the decorative qualities of these things, or the, all the little elements that we want to make this look like a specific desk instead of a generic desk. But that will come in time once I've got my initial kind of proportion figured out, once I've got my initial sort of space worked out. And I can add more and more complexity to this sort of scene. I can say, okay, well, what if we had, a bulletin board? Great. Well, that's going to be on the wall. So that's going to be 1-point perspective. I can just carry that sucker through, find those lines, and then of course add thickness and, more detail as I go. And all the core construction is going to look super solid because I'm basing it on, perspective and proportion. And then I can add, okay, there's going to be thickness to this particular thing. Do this as an initial kind of gesture, even though it's proportionate kind of gesture. And then there's going to be, notes on here and little doodads and things and schedules and calendars, all the things that, this student or whoever this is might have on their bulletin board. All the little decorative bits we can figure out later, But again, I've just quickly, proportionately filled up that space in a way that makes sense. If I've got, a computer here, again, same kind of deal. Maybe it's on a slight bit of a tilt. They've got their laptop or something like this in the scene. They've got a little mouse there for their laptop. They've got a pile of books on the table. I draw that initial kind of footprint, and then I build up the form. Once I've got these core shapes, it's really, really fast, if I know the proportion is working, for me to add all these little details. I want to have a garbage can here beside the desk. Great. Well, I'm going to, again, check the footprint. What is the footprint of this going to be? Put that ellipse in place. build that garbage can. I know the ellipses are going to be, wider on the bottom and thinner on the top. And now we've got a wastebasket there at the bottom. All kinds of those different little details I'm building in perspective as I go. And they're all going to be proportionate to each other because I'm building it off the scale figure. This also holds true even with stuff in the foreground. And this is something really, really common that I think a lot of students struggle with. They can understand, okay, how does this stuff all work? But what about the stuff that's off camera? How do I, make that feel like it's still part of the same scene? What's the exact same technique? If I take that scale figure and I transform again, I can scale them up, cross that eye line right here. If I want something right in the foreground, make sure that that eye line is in place. And then I can add whatever other kind of elements I want. If I want to have another table or if I want to have a couch in the foreground, I can figure out exactly how it is compared to the height of my figure and make sure that it's working at the proper size. So everything is in space. This would also hold true in the reverse direction. In theory, instead of having the door here, the way I've got it right now, let's say that we had the open door. Hold on, I've got so many layers going on here. It's getting a little bit chaotic. Let me find there's my door. So instead of having the door handle, let's get rid of that. Let's go into the hallway. So instead, we're going to have the hallway here, and we're going to have other stuff going on out the door. How tall are things going to be out that door? Well, we can do the exact same thing with the scale figure. We just duplicate the figure. Now we're going to shrink them down. So we're going to shrink them down, take them through the door. This is where they're standing at the end of the hall. Make sure the same portion of their anatomy is crossing. That's going to be the sizing for the hallway right here. That's going to be how it's going to fit together in this part of the hallway. So if I wanted to have another door, if I wanted to have other furniture or other things, if I wanted to have photos on the walls or any kind of stuff, anything I wanted to keep in mind, we can proportion it based on this figure in the hallway. Okay? It's really, really easy, really simple to work from these shapes and work from these forms. And once I've got these scaled figures, once they're working for me, I can move them anywhere I need to within the space. I can compare them. All I need to know is where their feet are right here on the ground. And then once I've got that, I just scale them up so that the same part of their anatomy is crossing the eye line. And then we'll have that consistency all the time. Everything is going to be working. So instead of worrying about, okay, well, how big should this particular object be? You can very quickly compare it to, well, is it ankle height? Is it knee height? Is it waist height? In between any of these, shoulders, neck, head, all these different things that you want to do to make sure that your scene is coming together. If I want to build a couch or something like that, I get that footprint, get that initial kind of footprint shape. How wide is a couch? Probably a little bit wider than I had it there. Or a bed or whatever else. Figure out what that footprint's going to be and then figure out the relative height. If this is going to be, most couches, we kind of laze our way into them and our legs can hang down. So the height of the initial cushion is probably going to be around knee height, no problem. But the back of the couch is going to be much taller. Great. So I'm just going to build that up. Cross here, get that initial box in space, make sure that it's fitting together. And this, initial rough box, just like the object drawings, we use this as our initial kind of form, and then we're going to break it down further. So this is the space, the rough space that this, particular couch is going to take up in the scene. And I just move my figure over here so I can use them for comparison. And now I can start looking up what does an actual couch look like. If I don't feel confident, I can look up some reference material of couches. I can kind of go, okay, there's all sorts of different designs for couches. We're going to have this kind of high back form with the cushions. And again, if I don't feel confident, I can always look up more reference material to really get this working for me. And then we're going to have the cushions here I want to find the halfway point, I can always do the X trick. And I've got those cushions kind of in place. I'm just sketching out these larger cushions on a bit of an angle there. And then we're going to have the little posts, this particular couch style design is going to have sitting on top there. And we wouldn't see the back one because it's going to be off camera. Great. Now I've got a proportionate couch that I've just dropped into place really, really fast. As an initial gesture, I can always go back into it. This is just an initial form, just a loose kind of construction, just like you did with your objects. I can then add another layer and go in and get more precise. Go in with a darker color, make more specific choices about the cushions or about the design. Be even more careful about the details and adjust, how these things work. Maybe there's the kind of base form, and then there's going to be the cushion, and it's going to be a little bit softer and worn. Once I've got that initial, building block, it's really, really easy to refine this stuff and make it that much more detailed as we go. But don't be intimidated by the proportion of these things, because once you've got that scale figure, it's going to become easier and easier for you to be able to recognize and build these forms and make this stuff look proportionate and make it look great in the scene. Now, this is a great tool. It's a really, really fast way for you to be able to build proportionate spaces without a grid. And you can do it quickly, save yourself a ton of time and get confident about what you're looking at and make sure that this stuff looks correct and, feels solid in the space that you're trying to work in. But it's not just, this particular angle. I don't want everyone to do a 1-point perspective, eye line across the eyes sort of situation. So what I want to do is I'm going to get rid of my example here, and I'm going to take the exact same kind of example here and show you a different approach to it. So now we've got the same kind of back wall box that we had before. We've got the eye line, 1-point perspective, same as before. Really, really simple, moving our way across. We've also got, the wall lines. The difference now is our eye line is low. Our eye line is not high. This time we've lowered the eye line. Okay. Really important thing. We've still got our one vanishing point in the middle. We've still got our eye line here, but all we've done is we've lowered our point of view. Remember, the eye line is not the eyes of the characters. It's our point of view on the particular scene. So if I put my figure now into the scene, notice the eye line is crossing their knees. What does that mean? That means in this particular shot that we're putting together, our point of view is on the ground. Either this is like a pet's point of view, or someone that's sitting on the ground, or someone lying on the ground, or a kid, or it doesn't really matter too much. We've just got a lower angle that we're going to be constructing things to. So all the things we're going to do is the exact same trick. It's just our proportion is now scaling through the knees of the character for the eye line instead of everything else. And what you're going to notice is there's that door rectangle. It's the exact same door rectangle as last time. The difference now is when I build that door, when I build that window, the window's on a much higher, the window box is much higher because everything about it is above the eye line. It's still, the same distance up to the ceiling. It's still the same, door that I proportioned as before, but we're looking up at it more than we did previously. If I want to have something like the bookshelf, I put the bookshelf in place again. The difference now is almost every shelf is above the eye line. So we're looking up at this shelf because our POV, our point of view, is lower in the scene. Okay. The same kind of thing if I want to build that desk. So now I've shifted the desk forward in this particular example. In this one, I drew it, previously. So we're underneath the desk. Our point of view is here beneath the desk. So we're looking at the underside of that particular desk and all the different things that we want to do, everything that we want to put together is going to be higher up in the scene because everything's above the eye line, right? I could add a light here on the ceiling because it's going to be easier to see, if I want to have all these other things. And again, the same trick is going to hold true. If I want to check my proportion, the difference now is this is the portion of the character's anatomy that's crossing the eye line. The knees are what is crossing the eye line. Therefore, that's how we're going to measure the proportion. When we compare the size of the desk here, notice that if I take that scale figure, I bring them next to the desk, this is a slightly lower desk than the previous one. The one I drew in the previous scene was up to the hip. This one's a little bit lower in this particular scene. Does it work? Sure. There are some desks that are a little bit lower and there's some desks that are a little bit higher. As long as it feels like it can work with the particular scene that you're building, then it's fine. So I've drawn some other details here. I've got the window. I added all sorts of detail there. I've got a different style of chair that I've put together. I've got the door handle. I've got the light switch, just some other little details that I put into the scene really quickly here. I can add some other stuff. I've got this foreground, character. Now their head is right off the scene because our eye line is so low. But again, the knees are the thing that's crossing the eye line. So the knees are going to touch the eye line as I scale them forward. So if I'm drawing the couch in the foreground, that's how it's going to work. If I'm comparing the couch, now, of course, we're on that lower angle. So that couch is going to be larger and it's going to be proportioned differently because the figure is so much larger when that part of the anatomy crosses the foreground. Notice that everything feels proportionate. Everything is, properly measured to each other in a really, really easy to understand way because we've got this scale figure. We can compare all the furniture. We can compare all the different pieces to make sure that it works in the scene and it feels like it's all cohesive. Okay. That's what's really great about this system. No grids required. And yet I've got something I can instantly compare to. Is this piece of furniture compared to a person? How does that feel compared to myself when I'm standing next to this furniture? Is it all in place in a way that makes sense? Okay. It's a really, really quick tool for checking perspective. In the exact same stuff that we're doing here also works in 2-point perspective. So don't think that this is just a 1-point perspective trick. If you've got this figure in place and you need to know how large things are, I'm not going to redraw everything out. But if you need to know how big things are at a particular point, all you have to do is grab that figure, move them to where you want their feet to be positioned in the scene, scale them up, and the same part of the anatomy crosses the frame. That's how tall they are at this part of the scene. I can move them around like a chess piece. I can slide them around as long as this is consistent. Whatever is crossing the eye line here, whatever's crossing the eye line there, if those two are consistent, then this is proportionate. Then I can compare and make choices. Now, in perspective, the one thing to keep in mind if I was drawing the actual character, and we're going to talk more about this, their feet would be slightly different in terms of 2-point perspective, the way they're mounted on the floor. But for overall measurement, it really works well. So again, I want to figure out where that door is. I want to figure out where all the furniture is. If I want to build that stuff with the footprint and then build it up from there, it's very, very, very quick for me to be able to get a sense of proportion, for me to get a sense of this furniture, figure out what that footprint is, take that back to the vanishing point, and then build those initial forms and then break them down further. And you'll have all kinds of furniture that is working properly for the scale of your scene. And it doesn't take long at all. That's one of the things that I think is particularly amazing about this. Okay, so that's a cool trick. But what happens if we change things up a little bit? So I'm going to take it back to, this is our original example, the exact same as what we had at the very start. We've got our eye line, we've got our single vanishing point, and we've got our box. This was the same proportionate room that we started with for this particular, example. Now I'm just going to change one particular thing in this scene, and we're going to see how it all kind of works. I'm going to change one thing. All I'm going to change is the scale of the figure. Oh, wow. So now, you notice our scale figure is really small. So instead of this being a dorm room or a bachelor apartment or something like this, our entire understanding of what we're looking at has changed. The eye line's the same, the vanishing point's the same, but we've changed the scale. Suddenly, this becomes a massive space. This becomes some sort of a garage or a warehouse or a factory or something on that scale, because this is the size of a person. When you do this kind of thing, I think a lot of times students get intimidated and they're like, oh my God, I don't know how to draw this. Everything is so large. And it's like, no, no, don't freak out. It's the exact same technique. You're just changing up the scale. So if I wanted to make something like a warehouse, I'm just roughing in these larger shapes and forms. Okay. So this is all shelving, huge shelving that you would use a forklift for. If I want to have a forklift, I'm roughing out those shapes and forms compared to the figure in the scene. I'm doing the same comparative proportion as before. Large shelving in the back, this huge garage door. How big is that compared to a person? How big is that compared to a vehicle? This is some kind of crate. Once you've got that basic proportion, the whole thing still works. You just use the different size of the figure as your scale. But how do you find the proportion when they're not touching the eye line? That's easy. All you have to do is stack them up. So in this case, I've literally got two of the same figure. They're right on top of each other's head, and that happens to cross the eye line. Lucky bit there. But it doesn't matter what portion crosses, as long as I've got those proportionate figures. Now it looks ridiculous, but the trick works even with these figures. So watch this. I take these two and I scale them up to the larger size. That is proportionate. That crate is now proportionate to these two figures stacked up in space. It looks ridiculous, but it allows us to check our proportion really, really quickly and make sure that the size of the objects here in the room are fitting with everything else. And then once I've got those initial forms roughed out and it follows the 1-point perspective, I can go into it and I can add all sorts of other details. I would tighten up all these little things, make this look like, the proper warehouse, go in and do all the details on the forklift, on the shelves, on the garage door, all the different pallets and boxes and all those things to make this feel like the warehouse, get that ceiling, built and everything else. Once I have my proportion figured out, it's very, very easy for me to be able to check everything against each other and know that my scene is proportionate, fast, 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 without any grids. That's what's so amazing about this. Okay, so you've seen all this stuff here, and it looks really cool, and you're all super impressed, and you understand the power of a figure as scale and how that, you can use that to make something look really amazing. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to create a space. I want you to create a room, 1-point perspective or 2-point perspective. I want you to use that 8.5 by 11, proportion 300 dots per inch, horizontal, of course, not vertical. And I want you to build a space where you're going to have a figure and furniture. There has to be at least one door, at least one window, and 4 other pieces of furniture. But I would like for you to, decorate it with stuff that's appropriate. Let me show you some examples from other students. Hold on one sec here. Here we go. So here we've got nice, simple, clean dorm room. This is just that proportionate kind of building blocks. For next week, you are not going to have final finished line art. What I want is this kind of rough building process. Everything is clearly what it's meant to be. It's not super, super detailed yet, but everything is proportionate. I can tell what's a window. I can tell what's a shelf. I can tell what else is in this space. For something like this, I like the chair design, but I would give this a little bit of a rotation so everything doesn't look too stiff. But on the whole, this is the kind of stuff that I want to see. Here's another one. This one's obviously more detailed and finalized, but for this initial drawing, what I want you to do is I want you to build out all these shapes, all these forms, make sure they're proportionate to each other, have that scale figure in there, and then I will show you how to do, digital cleanup, how to get this really tightly put together. And eventually we're going to add figures to this space. And probably not a big surprise to you considering the other stuff we've done. We did, basic forms, and then we did light and shadow. We did objects, and then we did light and shadow. Now we've built a room. We're going to do light and shadow here in the room. Not this week. This week, I just want you to focus on the initial building, the initial forms that you're putting together, the proportion and the space and the furniture to make sure that it's all fitting correctly. I don't expect that you're going to just summon this out of your mind. So make sure that you are looking up reference material of these objects, of this furniture. You're not trying to copy a photograph. You can kind of cast furniture from multiple sources. You can add all kinds of different things into the scene to make your room. But what's key here is that it's proportionate, that everything is built properly, that there's a nice clean sense of perspective, and there's a good sense of breaking down these forms. Okay, so get a sense of the kind of thing I'm looking for and the specificity. This isn't just generic table and chairs, generic bed, generic couch. There's a really good sense of, research and reference building that I think works really well. There's a nice, clear sense of what these items are and that they're well constructed and that they're consistent. I want you to have realistic proportion. So I don't want you to get really cartoony with this stuff. This figure that I used for my example, this stuff that I used here for my example is, relatively realistic, this particular figure in the scene. He's not like 100% photographically realistic, but he's got overall human proportion so that we can really tell who that is and that this is going to conform to a mostly, realistic setup. Does this make sense? I really hope so. I want you guys to feel confident that you can plot out a figure and furniture in a space, that you can place them in a room with confidence, and you don't need to use a grid. You just need to use a scaled figure to quickly check your proportion and make all your furniture and all your stuff make sense. I will send out, of course, an assignment email that's going to have these examples and tell you the exact requirements of what I'm looking for. The more you practice with this stuff, the more confident you will get, and you will realize how quick it is, how easy it is for you to be able to proportion spaces and make your rooms, your environments feel consistent. I don't know how long you spent on the room drawing that you did for your portfolio, but the answer was probably too long compared to how you could do it if you've got this kind of trick and these tools at your disposal. As always, if you have questions, feel free to check with the TAs or drop me a line. I will send you an email with the assignment requirements. Have a wonderful week. Plug away on this, and I will, and send me your constructed build of your room so that I can give you feedback next week.